So, welcome everybody to Rise Up and Carve guest speaker time. We have David Western, the Love Spoon expert. Welcome, Dave. Welcome everybody. Glad to see everyone. I don't know how much of an introduction you want, Dave, but I will say Dave's been carving love spoons for 20 years, doing super intricate, beautiful designs, and teaching carving as well for 30 years, right? Or
About 20.
20 years. Yeah. So, and he's written multiple books about love spoons, and done lots and lots of research. So I think it's really great to have you on to kind of talk about and teach us about them. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to just like launch into kind of like a brief history, or I mean, I know it's you could probably talk for hours, but
Yeah, I'll just bang away and get straight at it and hopefully have something interesting to say. Well, we'll see how it goes. So I'm as Kate says, I'm a love spoon carver. I specialized in that right off the bat. I'm not particularly good at eating spoons. I do enjoy doing them from time to time, but I confess I'm just not that great at it. My focus tends to be more into the love spoons. It's always been the thing that's kind of caught my attention. So I've spent quite a few years making them and a long time studying them. And what I've learned over the years is that there's a great deal more to it than originally I had thought, and that probably most people get through the media or on the internet or whatever. Love spoons maybe is kind of a misnomer for the probably more accurate description, which would be romantic spoon carving. The love spoons tend to be more of a Welsh thing, and they're the most famous. That seems to be where everybody knows them from. And these particular spoons, the Welsh love spoons, tend to be highly ornate, and originally were given as a gift from a young man to a young woman who he was attracted to, with the intention of initiating a courtship. The acceptance, contrary to a lot of the mythology that's out there, did not constitute a betrothal. Young women could accept them and then carry on in different directions if they felt, or it gave the young man a green light to initiate his courting process and try his luck as best he could. The significant thing with the Welsh spoons is that they are pretty much the only ones of the European styles that are carved today in any meaningful way. A number of the other countries still make romantic type spoons for different purposes, but it's really not the sort of big deal that it is. It's become kind of an iconic thing in Wales. So you see a lot of them in the tourist shops, and it's a sort of a known product, if you will. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because a lot of the ones you see in the tourist sites and on the websites tend to be machine made, mass produced. They're not particularly attractive. They, for the money that they charge for them, some of them are exceptional, but they still are pretty blunt and pretty crude representations of what was a much more vibrant craft in its day. In common with most spoons, romantic spoons carved from or throughout Europe, they seem to have originated sometime in the mid 1600s. This seems to be a time when people had a bit more time to work on sort of almost what you would call frivolous woodworking, decorating their tools, or decorating their implements, or decorating furniture in the house. it also coincided in the case of the spoons with the advent of metal spoons becoming increasingly popular among the gentry. And likely that this is the inspiration for the love spoon. Another myth in it all is that the Welsh love spoon evolved from the cowl spoon, which is a soup spoon and a stew eating spoon. And it's a great theory, and I can't really knock the theory, but I can say that after studying museum pieces for the last 20 years, I've yet to find an old love spoon that follows the spoon bowl shape that the cowl spoon had. They almost universally follow the shape, the more oval sort of egg shape that we're familiar with spoons today, that came about when metal spoons became popular. And this is also apparent in Sweden and Norway, two other big spoon carving countries, where a lot of the spoon bowls and the handles tended to follow the patterns and shapes of metal spoons, which were becoming sort of all the rage at the time. In different sections of Europe, the spoons had different purposes, and so it's quite a bit broader a field than initially I had sort of expected. The love spoon, as we know it, as people sort of think of it, is referred to sort of as a spoon, as I mentioned a second ago, that a young man would make to give to a girl to initiate the courtship. And that was how it played out in Wales for 300 odd years until, you know, it kind of fizzled out a bit and then rebounded as a tourist object. In some of the other areas, the spoons had quite different purposes, and I'll sort of elaborate on that in a minute. What I'd like to first sort of do is just show you a couple of examples of some real, like, true Welsh love spoons from the 1800s. I have a couple here that I've managed. I'm not much of a collector. I prefer to see these things in museums, and this is where these ones will go when I'm too old to carry on. But this is, if you can see it, I'll try and sort of locate it on the camera. This is a real classic example. It's badly beaten, of course. You can see it's worn, fallen off the wall a few times. You can see by the damage on the bowl. But if you look at the quality of the craftsmanship in here, it's exceptional. These little walls on the cages are wafer thin. The balls are beautifully carved. It used to have a swivel at the end here that was attached to another piece. So just a spectacular piece of woodwork, very, very difficult and very ornate carving, likely the work of a professional. I've come across 3 or 4 identical copies in museums, so it seems to be the work of someone who really knew his stuff. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum would be something like this, which is a little bit more crude. This is a style called a panel style, and it has its little symbols carved straight into the broad panel, and the spoon bowl is again the sort of oval shape common to the metal spoons. These are genuine type Welsh love spoons. If you were to compare those with the ones you'd see on the internet in the gift shop type places, you'll see that the ones for sale tend to be a little bit heavier, and the bowls are more crudely made because they're routing them or CNCing them rather than hand carving them. In those days, they would have primarily used 3 or 4 tools to make these, much as most of the utilitarian spoon carvers are doing to this day. Shape the rough billet out with an axe, and then they would carve the basic outline of the spoon with a heavy knife, and then maybe have a couple of finer knives for the detailing. Later on into the 1800s and whatnot, near sort of toward the end of the whole thing, they would get in with drills or maybe some treadle powered scroll saws and stuff. But for the most part, most of this cutting through the fretwork would have been effected either with an old brace and bit or just with the tip of the knife. So the main tools would have been the straight knife and a bent knife. And the bent knife, I noticed looking through some of the spoon carving sites on the internet, a lot of people still are using Tuka cams, big bent knife, hook knife. European ones tend to be quite different to the ones that we have out here in the West Coast, which is the ones I've kind of gravitated to. My hook knives look like this. So they're double bladed, the blade on both sides. Put that so you can sort of see the blade. And so the blade has quite a nice little hook on the end, but remains relatively straight down its shaft. These are the ones I use. This is a slightly more curved version. I'll see if I can get it to show up. There it is. Mine are based on the Northwest Coast native style knives. So it has a sharp blade on either side. And it can have a top or a back bevel. The ones I prefer the top bevel, although I've spoken to lots of people who really like the bottom bevel. And those are the tools I use to shape the bowl. My main knives for doing pretty much most of the body work are these little guys here. I use a nice little inexpensive OCC 1-inch knife by Mike Shipley, and a little flex cut Pelican, and its little brother whose tip got broken off one day, and provided me with a nice opportunity to make a really small little detail knife. And that's basically pretty much most of the tools I use to carve these. So although I carve a lot of Celtic knotwork and quite artistic-y sort of stuff in the handle that they wouldn't have done in the old days, the majority of the tools I use to do that carving tend to be rooted in the tradition that's been going on since the 1600s. I do use a couple of little gouges and chisels to do some of the detail on the handles, but for the most part, I would say good 80% of what I do is done with these couple of little knives here. So I know that lots of times when people come over and want to see a big tool chest, they're kind of disappointed when they see how few tools I actually have. I'm going to just sort of quickly discuss the sort of thing that separates a romantic spoon from a utilitarian type spoon or an art spoon. From what I've sort of seen on the internet, there seems to be three relatively distinct schools of spoon carving that have evolved over the last few years. The utilitarian guys, the barn the spoon sort of school that are working to make really effective eating spoons that are nicely shaped and, you know, easy to hold, functional, the utilitarian beauty sort of idea. Then you have some of the fellas that are into the art end of things, and they have the really, really wild designs. Often the spoons are highly unfunctional, but are laid out for their sort of artistic beauty. And then kind of falling in the middle of the romantic spoon guys like me, who are often carving a spoon that could be functional, but its main purpose is to be attractive and to bring out a message. And this is the main thing with romantic spoons, is that the message is often the most important part of the detail. Nowadays, with the internet and our sort of ability to access incredible amounts of artistic background and basically the world history of art, which our forefathers didn't really have. Modern spoons tend to be much more artistic. There's a lot more symbolism. Symbols are being kind of created all the time, especially in the tourist market. But initially, the symbolism on romantic spoons was pretty basic. There was not too many symbols, but the ones there were tended to turn up quite frequently. And it's these kind of simple symbols showing up that separates, if you're looking through historical references, these are what separate kind of the tools that would have been used for eating from the tools that would have been used for showing off or for attracting a mate or for indicating real skill and value as a suitor. A lot of these spoons were used to attract, a female, because of course in those days it was all carved by men and given to women. So the purpose of the spoon, not only to attract the woman, would often also be to impress her family and to indicate that the young man had some worth as a worker, and that he was tenacious, he could get a job done, he had hand skills. So he was, a relatively decent prospect, as it were. So what you'll see is even the most basic spoons will sometimes have a little bit of ornamentation on it that just indicate that the spoon is for a higher purpose than just eating. And I don't say that to offend the people who see a high purpose in eating, because I think that's a really a noble endeavor to be on, to design a really good eating spoon, because I honestly think it's much harder than it seems. It's hard enough that I don't try and do it because I'm not all that great at it. But what I'll sort of do here is kind of talk about how different little schools of romantic carving popped up and what their purposes were, and give you some physical examples of how some of these little spoons looked. So we talked about how the love spoon in Wales was kind of given as a romantic token to initiate a relationship, and it was a pretty serious endeavor. A young man would put a lot of effort into it and make a beautiful object, the purpose of which was to win the heart of the woman he was attracted to. So they weren't done on a whim. In some places, spoons were a little bit more frivolous. In some areas of Sweden, some areas down in Romania and Hungary, and that they would have spoons that we would sort of call feeler spoons, maybe. They would be spoons that would allow a young man to kind of gauge the lay of the land, as it were. And through the winter, either he or a professional that he would buy them off would make some fairly rudimentary little spoons, which he might decorate up himself a little bit with some further details. And then in the sort of spring festivals, when everybody would kind of come out from their farms and from the seclusion of winter and get together, the young men would hand out some of these spoons to young women who caught his eye, and he would kind of gauge their reaction to whether he could sort of carry on pursuing them or whether it was a dead loss. But they would give away little simple spoons that maybe look something like one of these. A fairly basic little bowl, a nice little handle with maybe some simple ornamentation, usually a little romantic feature like a heart or something that kind of indicated that the spoon wasn't strictly an eating spoon, that there was a romantic purpose to it. And these kind of spoons were not as seriously thought of as a love spoon in Wales would have been. A young man might go to a festival with a pocket full of them and give them out to 5 or 6 different women, and just see how things went for him. Conversely, the young women would often have their status greatly improved by how many spoons they got, and they would often show those spoons on a rack at home. And particularly desirable girl that maybe had 8 or 10 of these spoons would be pretty highly thought of. Conversely, at the same time, in different parts, even of the same countries, in sort of more conservative areas, doing something like that would be highly frowned on. Giving a gift before an actual wedding would be kind of thought to be a bit loose of morals. And if a young girl had a whole bunch of them in one of those regions, she wouldn't be thought of as highly as in some of the other regions. So it also gets quite complicated trying to study this stuff, because you have to kind of know the religious or social backgrounds of some of these areas to understand how the spoons kind of fit in these regions. Mm-hmm. After sort of the feeler type spoons, a more serious type of spoon especially in the Scandinavian countries, would be a courting type spoon. And these would be spoons that would be carved maybe as a sort of a dowry gift, or as a way for a young man to really impress the family. And they would involve a bit more detail. Often they would have, the balls or in cages, or the chain work, a really elaborate sort of handle design, lots of coal rosing in the bowl, the decorative etching that the Scandinavians were so fond of, really nice shaped bowls, good craftsmanship. These would be something that you'd make with some serious effort. And so they would have a sort of a distinct purpose, more as a wedding-y type gift, or as a real indicator that there was a serious relationship now going on, and these were a significant present to the young woman. The Welsh love spoon, as we discussed earlier, was serious as well. It was the sort of phase where you would do it all at once. You'd kind of throw your hat in the ring with the woman and hope for the best, and you'd give it your best shot. And if it all fell flat, boy, it would be probably a pretty hard knock to take, because a lot of them would put significant effort in. I've got a couple of little versions of the Welsh spoons that I'll show you, because I want to just sort of discuss the distinct styles that happened within Welsh love spoon carving. Initially, a lot of the spoons were fairly straight handled. Again, probably showing some effect of the inspiration of metal spoons. So they would have a fairly long, thin handle with the bowl and some decoration. As things progressed, they get into, some of the standard carver's tricks, the ball in the cage, lots of chain link, that sort of thing. And these were ways to, really show off your skill and to separate yourself from the rest of the field, especially if there was maybe more than one of you competing for the attentions of the same woman. These narrow handles, after a time, would kind of prove to be too small a display field for the young men. So they started developing what we call now a panel style spoon. And that's where the handle becomes broader, sometimes longer, and can get quite elaborate. This gave the young fellas the opportunity to get a little more crazy with the symbolism, with the decorative symbolism. And here you can see this is fairly standard for a love spoon of the 17 and 1800s. A fairly limited palette of symbols, but they can be quite significantly displayed. Hearts, of course, are fairly obvious, the romantic love heart. So they tend to appear both as fretted and as carved objects on the spoon. The little comma shaped thing you see there is one that's this little guy. Let's see if I can hit him with my finger, that one there. These little guys are quite controversial, because modern mythology says that Welsh sailors used to carve these after sailing to Egypt, and that they were inspired by hieroglyphics. And the shape is intended to represent your nostril, which is the portal to your soul, where your soul enters and leaves your body at birth and death. And so it's a soul symbol. More likely it's actually a raindrop. This is a symbol that turns up all through Europe in the 16 and 1700s on barn doors. I think even in the United States to this day, if you go to some of the like Amish regions and down Pennsylvania way, you'll see those on the sides of barns and stuff, usually in groups of 4 arranged in a circle. And it's believed that it's more of a fertility and growth symbol, a wish for prosperity in the fields, that kind of thing. The last one that appears quite often, I'm going to try and line these diamonds up so they have a white background. You can see all these little diamond shapes across the top of this handle. The diamond was a very popular symbolic feature in the old days, because it was a representation of the wish for prosperity, that that the young couple would have food and a place to shelter and whatnot. The wheel is another big one that turns up all through Europe and Wales. Is significant because it represents both sort of the wheel of life, birth, life, death, and the idea of eternity. Anytime you see a circle, it's generally a reference to the fact that there's no beginning or end to a ring. So again, it's why you see them as wedding rings. Just the notion of eternal love, I suppose, is symbolized by that. So the symbols started out pretty simple, and then as human beings are, you can't leave a simple thing alone. They got more and more complex. So what you started having happen was the addition of second or third bowls to represent, in the case of two bowls, unity and being joined at matrimony and that sort of thing. Occasionally there'd be a third little bowl that might represent a desire to have children. You can see that as these panels got wilder, the decorative symbols got wilder as well, especially using those circular patterns, which of course are very popular all through Europe in all the different schools of spoon carving, because they can be easily done with a simple compass, or even just drawn freehand with a little piece of string and a nail. So these type of patterns are very popular right from the Alps and down into Romania, right up to Scandinavia and across to Wales and Ireland. So that's the Welsh love spoon. After the idea of sort of the courtship and the initial parts of romance, the next stage would often be a wedding, and some countries developed their spoons to focus on the wedding aspect. Probably the most famous of these spoons, and ones that some of you may have seen, are the famous Norwegian wedding spoons. Those are a pair of spoons that are linked with a big long length of chain, and the couple would use these at their wedding ceremony to symbolically share a first meal and symbolically sort of unite. This pair is a pair I collected out in Norway, and it's kind of interesting because you can still see, if you look, I'm hoping the light works for you guys, but you can see the staining on the bottom of the bowl where the couple ate their first meal, and the food has stained the unfinished birch a little bit.
Mhm.
These kind of wedding gifts sort of showed up for the wedding. They weren't considered a kind of a courting gift. They were a spoon that was carved for the purpose of the wedding and to indicate the unity of the couple. Throughout Europe, there was different versions of them. Sometimes, like in the Alpine regions and often in Wales, a double-ended spoon like this would be carved, where the young couple would, same thing, they would eat the first meal together. Whoops. They'd eat their first meal together and symbolically be joined. In Sweden, they did have some fun with that. A lot of the carvers, being carvers, got carried away, and they would take that idea of the double-ended spoon and make spoons where the bowls were either in opposition to each other or were in positions where they were impractical to use or downright impossible sometimes. And they would give these to the couple at the wedding, probably after a few drinkies, and they would expect the young couple to try and share one of these to eat something at the same time. And of course, they'd all have a good laugh because the young couple would fail miserably. So a little bit of fun with an otherwise sort of serious product. Finally, one of the areas that causes some confusion when I'm doing research, and I think probably causes some confusion for people who study spoons in general, is that some of these spoons can be sort of romantic, but may have more of a familial purpose than a strictly romantic. Sometimes fathers would carve, nice spoons for their daughters or for their wives, or a brother might make a nice spoon for his sister, or family uncles making it for nieces or whatever. And so some of these spoons might appear a little bit romantic on the surface, but probably their intention was more as a nice family gift. Typical in that sort of thing would be things like some of these milking, creaming spoons from Switzerland, and some of the spoons in Northern Europe, where it was just something probably someone did over the winter and wanted to just elaborate a bit more than a normal spoon, and give it as a nice gift. The final sort of spoons, and these are really typical to the Breton region of France, are spoons that we could probably classify not so much as love spoons or romantic spoons, although they did have a tradition of carving spoons for romantic purpose, same as a lot of the other regions. But they also had a tradition of making these beautifully ornate wax inlaid spoons, which the young men would fold up. The spoon can be folded, and the spoon would be carried to a festival, or to a significant event like a wedding or whatever. And the young man would open these spoons up with great flourish, and try and impress all the young single women that might be around him with the skill of his carving. And if he didn't carve it himself, with the fact that he could afford to hire a professional who would have done it for him. Either way, he would have hoped to sort of present himself as a good catch. Some of these spoons, again, I think someone missed that. It's from Brittany, from the Breton region of France. They were really good at the elaborate geometric style wax inlay. So they would use sealing wax, or even melted sulfur, melted pewter, things like that, and inlay them into little cuts that were in the spoons. And the patterns could get really, really elaborate.
Dave, what were the country that the impractical wedding spoons were from?
Seems to be primarily in Sweden, a little bit in Norway, but most of them seem to come from Sweden.
Someone was missed that. So.
I used to know the Swedish word for it, but effectively, I think they were just called joke spoons, or impossible spoons, or something like that. And yeah, that was their purpose, was to be as impossible as possible. So that's sort of the main grouping of spoons. You have the feeler spoons, which are the sort of most frivolous. Then you have courting spoons, which are gifts that occur once things are underway. You have the Welsh style of love spoon, which is a significant gift that's given to initiate the relationship and hopefully keep it rolling. You have the wedding type spoons that were given at the end of the sort of romantic proceedings. And then the festival spoons that were kind of used as attention seekers. And finally, a small, probably subset of the family type, gift type spoons. And those are the kind of major types of romantic spoons. So it is quite a varied field. It's quite a broad sort of subject area. I'm still finding it pretty much every day. I learn a little something new about them. They're as more and more of the museums put more and more examples onto their digital sites, I find more and more different styles and different techniques and different types of spoons that I just didn't know were out there even a year or two ago. I think it bodes well for the future of this sort of thing. Our modern society is not really geared to romantic gifts like this. It's just not something I think we do that much anymore. Personally, I think it's a shame, because it's my area of interest, and I'd like to see more people doing it. But in reality, most people don't carve anymore. Most people don't make their own furniture or their own fabrics or whatever anymore. And so we've kind of lost that connection to that hand skill type of crafting. And I think we've also kind of lost the connection to romanticking things up. I, not being a psychologist or psychiatrist, I have no idea what the things going on in society are, but it just sort of seems like overall we do less decorative stuff for frivolous purpose than we used to. I kind of hope that when people see some of these different types of spoons and they see that they are beautiful, that they can be functional if you desire them to be functional. They're certainly full of meaning and purpose if you make them that way. So I think they're great things. I know that the tourist industry has got a hold of quite a few of these sort of things and maybe watered it down a bit, but I hold out hope that the exposure to it will make a few people kind of look a little deeper at the possibilities that are open to them as carvers. Certainly as you study the different cultures that did it and the different ways they did it, there seems to be a little bit of something for everybody. And I hope that the physical of seeing them in the museum collections and seeing them on the internet, combined with hopefully little evangelists like me running around saying how great they are, I'm sort of hoping that will encourage people to give it a bash, even if it's not something they want to turn themselves to like I have, that they'll be inspired to give it a go for a significant person in their life and make a beautiful little thing that they can be proud of, that has a little bit of symbolic meaning, that even if it doesn't get used, if it gets hung on the wall, I think it still can have an important part to play in people's lives when you make them something beautiful like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I won't bang on too much more because I think that's probably about as much as anybody can take in one day.
Can you speak a little bit to the I know it's not as common, but some of the other non-European, like maybe Indian and African spoons that you've come across?
Yeah, I know that the African tradition's pretty complex, and I'd sort of love to start studying it, but I've kind of found that just keeping up with the European has been almost enough for me. But I do know I've met people from different parts of Africa where they have similar sort of traditions, especially around the wedding spoons. And even some of them, some areas have spoons joined by a chain, much like the Norwegian ones, where they'll be used at a wedding or a significant event to show that sort of unity of two people using the spoon together as one. I know that a lot of the spoon carving from Africa tends to be quite ceremonial and quite, I think that, they involve a lot of the stories that might be important to different regions, and sort of the historical background of different areas. So I think quite like the art out here on the Northwest Coast, which is very symbolic and very rooted in different families' rights to have certain crests or certain symbolic animals or creatures or shapes that they can use. I think there's a lot of that. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about it and be able to tell you more about it. It just seems like such a vast area that it's kind of after what I'm learning about how big the European thing has got here. For me, the whole African Asian spoon thing just seems daunting.
Yeah.
If I was 20 or 30 years younger, I might take a run at it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I know that there's just spectacular spoons that come out of Africa. I've been lucky to see a few collections of them, and yeah, they are very impressive. But I think a lot of times significantly different in purpose to the type of spoons that that I'm studying in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Is there anything else you wanted to say, or should we open it up for questions or?
Yeah, fire away. Yeah, if anybody's got any, yeah, I'd be happy to tell you what I know, and if I don't know it, I'm happy to make it up on the spot.
Yes. Let me see if there's, oh yeah, Matt said, someone said that that came on late and was wondering about the tools. Um, you said there were like three or so, three or four, maybe five tools, basically knives, maybe a drill.
Yeah, certainly in the old days, the toolkit would have been pretty limited. Um, a lot of these, certainly in the early days of all this, a lot of these carvers would have been just people working on farms, or you know, it was a rural endeavor, and they wouldn't have had much. Um, Later on, you get professionals involved, as with anything romantic, things get competitive. And
Yeah.
it was the same with spoons, that the longer these spoons were around, certainly after a couple of 100 years, you got probably probably a lot of the craftsmen who worked on churches and were kind of itinerant, would go around from site to site carving churches or significant, details in some of the manor houses and things like that. They would also turn their hands to carving outside of their workplace, and it's very likely that some of them would cook up deals to carve for other people.
Yeah.
So they may have had a bigger range of tools. I'm guessing, like this one I showed early on in the talk. I'm guessing whoever had that was a highly skilled professional who likely had a big toolkit. But for your average carver, it would have been probably an axe, a long knife, and maybe a smaller knife, and then some type of hook knife, generally handmade. I would think they probably used an old bucket handle or a bit of plowshare or whatever and beat it into a curve and used that. I know a couple of the ones I've seen in Wales in the museum, the old Tuca cams, that a couple of them look like they were pretty much handmade from whatever they could lay hands on, and a couple of the other ones looked like maybe a professional tool maker made them, like a blacksmith or someone who had some knowledge of how to curve a blade. But for me, I just, like I was saying, I use basically these two fairly straightforward Northwest style bent knives. I have a box full of these. I confess in my early days, I got carried away buying them because there was an old fella in the neighborhood that used to make them, and his prices were great, and I kind of wanted to support him a bit. So I bought a few more than I'll ever need, but these two are the ones I gravitated to and use most of the time. And then these three little basic simple knives, again, just an OCC straight knife and a couple of little flex cut pelicans, do pretty much everything I need to do.
I was gonna ask Dave, I noticed like when I was trying to carve, because I'm usually not carving dry wood, but I noticed that I felt like when I let my spoon dry, it was easier to carve the small details. Um, because it was just more, I don't know, it was more crumbly when it was green for those tiny little details. And I know you carve dry wood. Is there anything, is that kind of just, to me it seems easier for the details to be crisp when it's dry.
I found pretty much the same. Yeah, I often when I'm doing kind of the Norwegian style spoons and a couple of the more sort of traditional looking spoons, I will begin with a green billet and do the bowl shaping and some of the rough handle shaping while it's wet, because it cuts quicker and a little bit nicer for that sort of stuff.
Right.
But yeah, when I get into some of the detail work, I've definitely noticed that it has to be dried out.
Yeah.
So sometimes some of the wood I have is very dry. I've had it sitting around in the shop for years and years, and it, I'll get going on that, and it's too dry, and it's just like carving concrete. But for the most part, if I can catch it around 6 months to 2 years, that seems to be for what I do an ideal time. Um, I know that if I was making eating spoons, I would not want to do it that way, and I sure appreciate that when I shape a bowl. It can add a lot of time the drier the wood gets.
Yeah.
It's definitely not as convenient. But yes, some of the wood, especially like birch and willow and things like that, if they're wet, they just don't take detail at all.
Yeah. Someone had a question. Do you ever attempt love spoons with the captured balls or linked chain ornaments? They seem
Yeah.
impossibly fiddly.
Well, they're like everything, they're tricks, which is what made them popular pretty much in all the carving cultures all over the world. Um, it's just something, yeah, you have to do them and do them and do them. And the first few you do are terrible. And then all of a sudden you get one that works. And then you do a few more. And I guess it's like ice skating. I remember when we came to Canada, I thought that ice skating was absolutely impossible, that nobody could ever do it. And then one day I managed to stay up for a couple of seconds. And then I realized that you could do it. And then after that, I couldn't figure out what the problem was, why I'd had such a difficult time. And I think it's the same with these. You just have to learn a few of the tricks and then go out and do it and do it and do it until it's almost sort of second nature. I got to be honest, I still struggle with some of that stuff. My patience for getting a ball out of in a cage is not maybe what it should be, but over the years, I've learned a few of the little tricks just to make life a little easier for myself. I know there's some fellas on YouTube that have some nice little videos that break it down. And basically, it's just a step-by-step thing that you do a few times, and then it's not as scary as it once was.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I remember you were telling me that you had started off doing some of those Norwegian chain spoons when you first started carving.
Yeah, I learned a big lesson there. I had read that this style of spoon was always carved from one piece, the handles and the chain, and you can certainly do that. But what I learned from buying a few sets of antiques is that pretty much everybody made the two handles, and then they made the chain as a from one piece, but as a separate entity that they then joined. Because when I get on with a little magnifying glass, I can always find the little glue joint in the final link. And of course, I made the mistake the first time out of doing it all from one piece, which is it's doable, but it's a horror show, and probably added 3 times, the time that it took me to do. And certainly, with the Norwegian style, once professionals got involved in this, and if there's one thing about professionals, they don't like wasting material or time. And this is a colossal waste of material when you make out of one piece, because you lose a great big chunk out of the middle.
Mm,
So if you're making them in 3 pieces with the 2 handles and the chain, it's much more effective. Plus, it enables you to do that chain without the constant sort of worry of breaking it off at the handle end.
yeah.
So yeah, there's all things to be learned.
Yeah. Does anyone ever have any other questions? I find that, after researching a little bit, um, no matter how much reading I do, I learn so much when I try to carve something. It's like experimental archaeology. Like, I'm like, okay, obviously for the really, really fancy spoons, they had to pick a really beautiful piece of straight wood and, straight grained wood, and just, all the little things you think about when you're actually carving it, that you think those people were thinking the same things probably.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the technique would be exactly the same in 1600 as it is now. You know, you take your little block of wood and you split it out so you follow the grain. You try and get the nice stuff with no knots, and then you know, always shaping so you're with the grain and not having too much that's cross grain or working against the grain.
Right.
Identical principles. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Dave,
yeah, I
I have a
mean,
question.
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
David, you shared some picture or some spoons that you had from museums. Did you have any from your own collection that you've made that you could share?
I have a couple of my more modern ones here. I'll show you. Like I say, my little angle on it, I've gone off kind of in my own direction. So I've tried to stay with the tradition in the sense that I carve my spoons from one piece as they did in the old days. I try to make it symbolic in as many ways as possible for whoever's going to receive the spoon. But with the designs, I've gone places where either they would have never thought about it or they just wouldn't have had the tools to do it in the old days. So, and one of the things I've done that, you know, wouldn't have been done in the old days is the Celtic style. This one's a little frog that's jumping off the bowl. You know, the Celtic knotwork is very beautiful and thought of as very old, which it is. But in terms of love spoon carving, it's only been probably since the 60s or 70s that anybody's ever done it on a love spoon, because they just didn't have the techniques or the equipment in the old days. I also tend to I'll use a lot of art from different regions and different time periods to make spoons. This little guy here is a little Visigoth design I saw one night on a TV show, and I managed to grab a screenshot of it and then kind of made my own version of it using the birds in maybe a slightly more romantic way with the little heart and all that. But you know, again, this would have been stuff that would have been very rare in the old days because they just didn't have access to as much art and as much history as we do. And then finally, you know, I like to do stuff like this every once in a while where I'll just take some patterns and run wild with it a bit. Again, this is just like more, I guess it's more to the arty end of things. You know, the bowl is significant, the heart-shaped bowl, and the vine thing is an old sort of symbol for growth and whatnot. So there is a bit of symbolism in it, but for me, it's, I suppose, leaning out toward the arty end of things, which I enjoy doing. But I also really enjoy the traditional end of things too. This is one that's off the pattern that Kate hosted for this particular event, the Do Yourself a Love Spoon pattern. So this was my version of it, kind of in a alpine type style, using the sort of more alpine regions, the way they would carve their circular patterns, chip carve patterns around the border and things like that. So yeah, I kind of like to go in all sorts of directions. It's a bit like listening to music, you know. I like to listen to a bit of Mozart, but I also like a bit of Metallica. So
yeah.
you know, I try and do as much as I can. Recently, I've been getting into these quite traditional, you know, based heavily on traditional, like they're not copies, but they're very accurate facsimiles. This is the kind of thing that someone would have made around 1812, 1820. You know, the techniques are pretty similar to what they would have used.
Do you know when coping saws came into the picture?
Well, it seems to be an 1800s-y sort of thing. I know that certainly in the sort of later part of the 1800s, all through Wales and Scandinavia in particular, you got a lot more fretted spoons suddenly appeared, especially around the time where fretwork was really becoming popular on housing fascias and on furniture and things like that.
Hmm.
And I think that probably coincides with treadle powered scroll saws,
Yeah.
which I think are kind of a mid to late 1800s invention.
Hmm.
Likely before that, they would have figured out jeweler's saws from the jewelry trade. So they probably used those a little bit. But certainly a lot of the examples I found in museums, it seems to be that they, the fretwork like this sort of stuff, they actually physically cut that out with a knife. So
Yeah.
they would have, rough shaped the handle down and then made the handle quite, you can see, fairly thin.
Hmm.
And then that would have allowed them to cut through a bit more easily than trying to work a thick blank.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the symbolism now that we have in our modern culture. So many symbols, and just finding what's meaningful for us today as carvers, versus what was meaningful. And maybe there's some overlap, but then obviously there's probably a lot of new stuff too. And then some of the universal symbols, that are just always feel meaningful over the ages. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just, it can be as simple as just putting a heart on a spoon.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right away, without having to say a word to anybody, everybody that sees that spoon understands that connection,
Right.
that there is a romantic intent, or, not necessarily that it's trying to win you over as a romantic gift, but that there was some romantic thought went into it.
Yeah.
I know that some people come along and they'll just do something as simple as a couple of initials on a spoon, personalize it a little tiny bit,
Mhm.
and you have a little heart and a couple of initials, and all of a sudden you got yourself a romantic spoon. It's fairly easy to get them started.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where it's like the gateway. You have your little heart, and the next thing you know, you're doing Celtic knotwork and all kinds of fancy fretwork and things like that.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I do want to be respectful of the time. So it has been an hour. So if there's anything else we want to add, or any last questions, maybe we can go ahead. I don't know. I really appreciate you coming on, Dave. This is like really, you have such a wealth of knowledge, and it's great to kind of get access and
Well, it's been a pleasure for me, and I hope I'll come on and get on the website when people are carving and join in more as a fellow carver a couple of times and do
yeah.
that too.
Oh,
Yeah,
and
this is
do you want to mention your website? Because I know that you have some beautiful pictures of your spoons on your website.
yeah. I'm at www.davidwesternlovespoons, all one big long convoluted thing, .com.
Great.
davidwesternlovespoons.com.
Yeah, I have this book of yours, the history, and it has some great um modern examples. And then, like, I love this one that has the
Oh,
spectacles.
the old spectacles. Yeah. They had, I mean, it's lots of them had sense of humor. They do stuff like that, or the backwards bowls and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that peek into the sense of humor. Well, anyway, I will, if no one else has questions, I will stop the recording. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for being here, Dave.
Okay, and thank you all. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.